you, Ken, for the introduction and inviting me to present here. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. And as Ken mentioned, we've been at this a long time. And the issue of HERS and Passive House kind of having different opinions on things, I think has been a bit of a conundrum for people since the first Passive House was HERS rated. So we'll look into that in detail and in specific around a case study that I did and look at the why, kind of look under the hood and try to figure out, get clues to why these two systems differ and ways to cope with that and move forward. Try to get perspective on the whole thing. And there we go. All right, so the outline. I'm going to just briefly talk about what HERS is and what Passive House is briefly, because many of you are already familiar. And then look at a case study that was basically optimizing a single-family production home to Passive House in parallel with a HERS optimization and where those things came out, and start looking at beyond that, why these two things differ in terms of the energy model, end use assumptions, shading, and energy metrics. And then a perspective on performance. I view Passive House as performance versus a term I think I've coined called modeled compliance, which I would categorize HERS and a number of other systems as. And then some observations on compliance, and then conclusions, and then questions and answers. So HERS and Passive House. HERS is the basis of many incentive programs, and according to their website, over 4 million homes have been rated, and 360,000 homes a year. More than 28% of all new homes constructed in the US are HERS rated. So it doesn't seem like something that's going away. So it's basically a significant entity. And there has been frustration with, as I mentioned, within the Passive House community along the lines of, we're designing these really efficient, and I'll refer to homes because this is around single family homes. And it's really hard to get better than a 30 or a 40, even though we've got incredible building performance. So what is HERS? HERS stands for Home Energy Rating System. It's administered by Residential Energy Services Network, or ResNet. And the idea is when you rate a home, the home is, you put your design in, they create a reference home that's the same size and shape, and they apply the 2006 IECC prescriptive measures, which are here. Don't need to go into that in detail, but it's basically a set of prescriptive measures by climate zone. And then the score that you get is a percentage of the reference home's energy use. So if you're scoring, if you're using the exact same energy as your design with these prescriptive measures, your HERS score would be 100 for 100%. In this example, this home using 65% of the energy of the reference home gets a score of 65. And so bigger number, more energy, lower number, less energy, and 0 would be a 0 energy home. Another thing to note about this, on-site renewables can be used to bring the score to 0 or decrease it or whatever, or even make it negative, I would assume. What is Passive House? It's kind of the classic recipe for it. It's a building performance standard and a design and construction methodology. And this is my slant on it. I don't think anyone would disagree, but focuses on high performance buildings that are inherently comfortable. And the energy efficiency derived from Passive House is a consequence of that inherent comfort. And I think that is an important distinction between Passive House and another metric, and it's not a critique of other metrics, but another metric such as HERS, which is just focused on energy use. Doesn't really talk about the how or the why one gets to that point. Passive House goes to great lengths to start with a well-balanced shell that's really well balanced to the environment. And so the energy efficiency comes from that comfort and performance. This case study, this is from 2012. It was a Denver production builder, and at the time, I was training passive house consultants, and the head of this company and one of his executives flew from Denver to San Francisco to take the training. They were very, very keen on this, and they were doing a lot of pretty conscientious construction in the Denver area, and they were offering a zero energy home at cost parity with their standard home. So the idea was you'd pay more, get a photovoltaic system, but between the higher mortgage payment but lower utility costs, the goal was to offer that essential out-of-pocket cost to the owner at the same price. And they recognized that PV subsidies might be declining, and they wanted to be able to continue doing this with a smaller PV system. And the stated goal was a HERS 40 before the PV is added. And so in the training, I shared with them I have some optimization tools that I've developed for Passive House, and I described, it was sort of like at the end, like taking this to another level kind of discussion, and I shared that, and we did a little trick where we rotated the house. We used PHPP and sort of spun the house 360 degrees and saw how the heating demand behaved as it changed orientation. Anyway, he was quite taken with that, being very focused on cost optimization, because production building is a really tight margin business. And so after the training, he commissioned me to take this home and optimize it to Passive House. And in parallel, had a HERS provider give them a HERS 40 version of that house as well. And so it was an interesting opportunity to see how those two things aligned or did not. And just for context, Denver climate zone, CZ5B, it's pretty cold, 6,000 heating degree days, at least to me in California and Bay Area, around 700 cooling degree days, and high levels of solar gain. So first thing I did was took their existing or their proposed design, and I put it into PHPP, the Passive House Planning Package, the energy modeling software from PHI for designing Passive House. And these are the measures, but heating demand came out at 21.35 kBTU per square foot per year. Passive House limit is 4.75. And another thing I'm particularly focused on is the overheating. So a metric in there, overheating if you don't have mechanical cooling, that was at 22.1%, which I find to be very, very high. So those two things jumped out at me as areas of focus. And so I was talking about the optimization tools that I use. So this is basically a front end that I've developed for PHPP. And what it does is it takes all of the envelope measures that might be in question and plots them on a graph. In this case, this is a graph of heating demand here. And what it does, where all of these things cross, that's the current design. And what this software does is adjust each of the envelope measures down to 10% of their value and up to about 200% of their value, and plot how, in this case, heating demand changes as those things are adjusted. And so basically, the term for it is a sensitivity analysis, and it shows you which envelope measures are most effective at changing the output. And so you look, if you're increasing or improving something, you look for the steepest downward lines. And in this case, no shock to anyone, if we just scroll back here, the air tightness here was around 2 ACH50, going to 0.6 in a cold climate. So air tightness and the solar heat gain of the windows and the U value of the windows were the most powerful drivers of reduction. Then over here, another graph, but instead of looking at heating demand, this is looking at the percentage of overheating. And unfortunately, one of these things here that most helps me with heating demand, the solar heat gain, is also most increasing the overheating. So I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place in terms of making that adjustment. Anyway, this is where I got to with the passive house upgrade, and I'm calling it incomplete. We'll talk about that in a moment, mainly because I was not tasked with doing architectural changes to the building, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But what I've done here is I've bolded the changes that were made from their proposed to this passive house upgrade. So the walls in the proposed design or current design were R33. We went to R42. The windows were US triple pane in this kind of configuration around the building. We went to a European triple pane, tuned solar heat gain, so low solar gain on northeast and west, higher solar gain on the south, and cut the east glazing down quite a bit, raised the south glazing quite a bit, half the east and 2.6 times the south, and I put unshaded here, and we'll get to that in a minute. The unshaded south windows is what that means. And then air tightness 0.6. The previous building had a supply only, so 0% heat recovery in the ventilation up to 80%. And we went from 21.35 to 4.67 annual heating demand, which is passive house. The cooling jumped up quite a bit. Again, going back to that previous slide, the tool I had to improve heating hurt the overheating and hurt the cooling. And likewise, it went from 22% to 34% overheating, which is way too much in my opinion. So this is called incomplete. And not just a note to you, but note to self here. I critiqued myself twice by saying need shading and underlined it 2 times. Okay, looking at the passive. So applying that same sensitivity analysis now to the passive house as opposed to that proposed design. This is looking now at combined demand, so heating plus cooling, because as we saw, some measures may improve heating but hurt cooling. So this is a sum of the two, and it's just looking at what can we do to decrease that. And really their heat recovery, which we're getting close to tapped out on, and then window U value, again, getting close to our limits on that, and then thermal mass. Those were the 3 things basically left over. Thermal mass, again, hinting toward an excess of solar gains, and then looking at how we improve the overheating. Again, the thing that would most decrease that is lowering the solar heat gain of the windows, or also decreasing the quantity of the front windows. And I will get into this more in the further, but in this case, it was facing front. But there are 2 categories of front windows here. I have front windows and I have front porch windows, which will be a hint toward where the plot thickens later. Oh, sorry. Anyhow, next thing we looked at was, what are the HERS scores for the passive house? And there was also, like I mentioned, a HERS provider created a HERS 40 home for this client. So we look through here, and again, you can compare these, but like I think maybe the most telling. So as I mentioned, at the beginning, there's a reference home, which is the 2006 IEEC measures. And so using PHVP, I put this home into PHVP and modeled it. This is a HERS score of 100 because it's the reference. Heating demand 44 kBTUs per square foot per year. And as we mentioned, the existing was 21. The HERS 40 actually went up higher, and you'll see actually that the provider dialed back some of the efficiency measures from their existing design and still got a HERS 40, but it's in the, you know, in the realm of 2026, you know, and this in the percent, in this parentheses here, that's the percentage that the heating demand of this particular design is of the reference. So the HERS 40 was about 59%, or about a 40% reduction in heating demand from the reference design. The passive house was 11% of reference, so what we're used to seeing, right? About a 90% heating demand reduction. And again, I've reminded myself I have an unresolved heat shading issue, but sort of the, you know, the big kicker here about this whole discussion is HERS 40 building got a 41, or actually a 3, HERS score of 3 with about a 10 kilowatt PV array. The passive house got a 34. So again, this is kind of drives some of us a bit batty. Like, I did all this work. I cut the heating demand by 90% in a cold climate, and I'm barely moving that needle. It's at least from this one. So why? Here are some of the reasons. So both passive house, again, using the passive house planning package, and HERS rating have energy models. The HERS rating software is called REM rate. I don't know what that means, but there's some acronym. Anyway, we can look now, again, the HERS reference building, the proposed HERS 40, and the passive house that I developed. First, looking at it through the PHPP results, heating demand, cooling demand, and combined demand, just meaning they're added together. PHPP sees the reference building as having 88,000 BTUs per year, kBTUs per year. And like, you know, looking at basically 59% of that for the HERS 40 and 11% as we discussed earlier. And we can look at the combined as well. The passive house got about, you know, 80% reduction of heating and cooling over the reference, whereas the HERS 40 got about 40% reduction. REM rate, by contrast, you know, where PHPP thinks that reference building's using around 88,000, REM rate's saying it's about 53,000. So it's seeing, REM rate sees the reference building as performing far better than PHPP does. Also sees the HERS 40 building performing quite a bit better, right? 52 versus 30. Passive house, it actually sees it as performing worse, right? In PHPP, we had 9,400, let's say. REM rate says no, 11,300. So if we just look at, you know, we compare these combined demands of the total reduction, right? Passive house was getting to be about 18% of the reference if you add heating and cooling together. REM rate, you know, according to the passive house, the PHPP model, REM rate says no, it's really more than that, and you're really doing about 30%. So, you know, the takeaway, REM rate sees better performance of the reference home and the HERS 40 home, and worse performance from the passive house. And passive house, by contrast, sees better performance for the passive house and worse for reference and HERS 40. And I suppose, you know, that's to be expected because both me and the HERS provider are going to use the tool that we have and optimize to that. So both of us use what energy model we were using to come up with what goal we had. But this is one piece of why the HERS score for passive house isn't quite correlating the way one might expect, at least from a passive house perspective. Another thing about this, again, the HERS rating is not about combined heating and cooling demand alone, but it is about total energy use. This is basically the whole basis for that score. And partly because of my, you know, my incomplete model had excessive cooling demand to I mean, it's right now, it's like in PHP, almost the same as the reference building, right? I mean, pretty bad cooling performance, in my opinion. Even in REM rate, it's worse than the HERS 40. So anyway, when you combine heating and cooling together, the fact that cooling is high is going to decrease the value presented by that heating reduction in terms of overall energy use. Another reason for this, this discrepancy between these two is the end use assumptions about, between what REM rate thinks and what PHPP thinks. And here we have the end use in these rows: heating, cooling, hot water, lights, appliances, fans, and miscellaneous electrical loads, MELs, which are basically plug loads. And we can if we just look at the passive house, this is the reference home again. This is the HERS 40. But we can see here, this is the passive house modeled through REM rate. This is the passive house modeled through PHPP, or passive house planning package. And what we see, hot water, and here I have it, maybe it's a bit confusing, but I didn't know which units folks would like. So this one's in kilowatt hours per year. This is KPT BTUs per year. But just taking the first one, about 4,500 for hot water. Passive house thinks is about 2,400. So about half, passive house thinks about half the hot water heating energy. A bigger difference in lights, right? So lighting energy, REM rate thinks it's about 1,300 kilowatt hours a year. Passive house thinks it's about 130. So that's a 10-to-1 difference of opinion in lighting energy. And then similar for plug loads, right? REM rate thinks about 3,300 kilowatt hours a year. Passive house thinks about 376. And so when you add all of this together in terms of overall site energy, REM rate thinks the passive house is using about 13,000 kilowatt hours per year, and the HERS 40 using about 14,000 kilowatt hours per year, which is not all that different, right? The REM rate's 50% of the reference home. The HERS 40, REM rate thinks the HERS 40 is about 50% reduction of the reference home. REM rate thinks the passive house is 46% reduction, 46% of the reference home. So a slight bit better, 4% better improvement, but not very much, compared to passive house planning package thinks that it's about a 75 or 80% reduction over the reference home, which is again what we in passive house tend to, isn't that kind of the classic line, like a 90% heating reduction and an 80% energy reduction, something like that. So this is consistent with what we expect and see in passive house, but REM rate does not see it that way. And in this case, it's because of these differences in lighting, hot water, but particularly plug loads and lighting. And going back kind of to that energy model as well, REM rate is also assuming presumably a lot higher internal heat gains. So the heating a less efficient building is going to have better heating performance than a passive house might think, because REM rate's assuming there's a whole lot more internal heat gains to help with that, and conversely with cooling. So again, domestic hot water, lights, and the plug loads are much larger in REM rate than in PHPP. And I'm talking here, even if we're just rating just the passive house, apples to apples comparison. And again, as I talked to you before, having one single number, meaning in this case, site energy, blunts the shell improvements, right? Like it's sort of basically saying, well, it doesn't really matter how low your heating demand is if you're using all that energy up with plug loads, right? Like your kids have 19 Nintendo Switches plugged in, or whatever it is that it takes to do that. The heating reduction doesn't matter so much if you have a lot of other end uses. And it's also why passive house puts a lot of effort into the efficient, once you have an efficient shell, you look at efficient lighting, appliances and equipment, so that improvement is brought all the way through into the energy end use. Another piece of this is how the shading is determined, and this is sort of where I was going to get back to, I was hinting at before. This is a diagram of my results from the Passive House planning package, analyzing each window. And as people that use the software know, each pane of glass is a separate window in PHPP. And what you're seeing here is the blue numbers are percentage for winter, the red numbers are summer. And even though it's called shading, it's kind of the reverse. Like the bigger the number means the less shading. So maybe it should be called solar access. So like if we look up here, there's a 91% in winter and an 81% in summer. That's a window that is not very well shaded at all. If we look under the porch, you see that they're all, or many of the, particularly the upper ones, are in the 20%. So that's a heavily shaded window. Anyway, this was a piece that I uncovered that seems obvious after the fact, but as I started this optimization, I didn't have the south windows separated in my optimization. I just had all the south windows as one thing, and I couldn't improve the heating performance by increasing the number of windows. And then I realized I had to divide those into the essentially unshaded windows and the shaded windows, because these windows are so heavily shaded that increasing the area of that glass doesn't help with winter performance. But the other side of this, kind of a lesson for folks, this is not a very effective shading strategy. You can see these windows are basically completely unshaded. And so that is, without making some kind of architectural adjustment, while those windows are helpful for winter demand, and in fact necessary, because Denver's it's pretty cold, and I needed solar gain to make this work. But because these don't have good seasonal shading, they extract a heavy price in terms of cooling for the heating improvement. Another thing I noticed on these is that in Passive House, we model not only the building, but the surroundings. And these are production homes, and the neighboring homes are pretty close together. And so a lot of these side windows in winter didn't get much gain, but in summer got, they were basically only serving to heat the home in summer. And that was another reason I decreased that size in my optimization. So Passive House does pretty exhaustive calculations about the shading, about the solar access to windows. REM rate has 4 possible values that you enter. And I think they're by orientation. And so the HERS 40 home had the shading percentages set to 40% shading on north and 70% on the east, south, and west. So much less granular than this. And so that could also explain some of the discrepancy between these results. Another reason that these could diverge is the energy metrics that are used. And so Passive House, at the end of the day, focuses on primary energy or source energy, or also primary energy renewable. And I won't go into that, but these are basically the energy use metrics that Passive House relies upon. And the imperative behind that is measuring the environmental impact of the building. In HERS, for domestic hot water heating and cooling, they use, and this is a mouthful, but they use something called the normalized modified end use load. And I only put these equations in here to just sort of, I'm not expecting it, there will be no quiz on this, to just show the complexity of this. And apparently the idea behind this is that, as folks know, if you're using electricity for heating hot water, heating the space or cooling the space, and you're using a heat pump, you can have a pretty high efficiency, right? You can have an efficiency above, in fact, we expect efficiencies above 100%. Whereas if you're using a gas appliance for heating, I guess you would, well, cooling wouldn't be part of that, but gas appliance for domestic hot water or heating, you're going to top out at about 95%. And apparently, again, because HERS is a nationally utilized metric and it's tied to a lot of incentive programs, there were people who were concerned that gas appliances would be disadvantaged if it were just a measure of how much energy were being used on the site. So rather than using site energy for the HERS score, this normalized modified end use was developed, and it's basically comparing the site energy your building is using compared to the best rated appliance of the same fuel type that you could use, right? So if you're using gas for let's just talk about space heating. If you're using gas for space heating, rather than comparing that site energy use to what site energy use might be, used by a heat pump, they're going to only compare it to the best natural gas furnace that's available. So they sort of separate electric heating from gas heating and compare them within themselves and come up with some kind of measure for that. And perhaps does not matter if you're doing an all electric building. In fact, it wouldn't, but this would tend to blunt the advantages of using heat pumps. Okay, so with all that, what's my perspective on this? So as I mentioned, PHAUS is a performance metric. I view HERS as a modeled compliance metric. I don't think they're the same things. And my analogy would be the difference between bookkeeping for your business and your tax return. And they both serve purposes and they're both important, but they're both, in the case of a bookkeeping and tax return, are connected to your profits and your income, your expenses, your profits, but what they report are very different things, right? And what their purpose is very different things. So with the bookkeeping of your business, you're focused on performance and accuracy, right? If you want a profit and loss statement, you want that to be accurate. Tax return, I don't know anyone that would view, anyone running a business who would use their tax return as the basis for judging their performance, right? There are a lot of rules in a tax return that change, deductions and all sorts of things like that, that fundamentally change the profit you might have here to a very different number in a tax return. And the emphasis of a tax return is not accuracy, it's complying with legality and to some degree equity, right? And we won't go too deep into that. I'm not going to debate tax returns, but point being, I think these two things are somewhat a good analogy for how these two approaches measure energy. These are measuring money, these are measuring energy, but they take a similar approach and have similar implications, I think. Some observations about compliance. So compliance is sticky to the reference, whatever the reference is. And as we know, there are diminishing returns for efficiency measures. So let's say we have a certain thickness of insulation. We'll say that it's an R worth of insulation. And there's a heat flow through it. We'll just call it Q. If I add the same amount of insulation again, I get a 2R wall, let's say, and I get half the heat flow through it at the same temperatures, right? So that's a 50. I've doubled the insulation and I've gotten a 50% improvement from the previous. But if I add the same amount of insulation again, as I did this time, I get a 3R wall and I get a third of the original heat flow, but that's only a 33% reduction from the previous, right? So the first time I added this much insulation to it, I got a 50% improvement. I add the same amount again to that, I only get a 33% improvement. Or another ways of thinking about it, if I want a 50% improvement from here, I've got to double this much insulation, right? So in any case, this is a generalization about how efficiency measures work, but generalizing, and it varies with which efficiency measure you're discussing, but it's a reasonable analogy. If we're to sort of plot that in a general sense, what you see is if you're trying to reduce your energy use from the reference, and let's just say that would be the reference, right? The 100%. So that could be the HERS reference. This also, for that matter, applies to ASHRAE, California Title 24, whatever. You've got your reference building, let's say at 100% energy use, and you want to reduce it. Well, as we go further this way, so this is the cost of those reductions versus what the percentage reduction is. So let's say we want to reduce it this much, right? If we're close to the reference point, it costs that much, right? It's just, you want to come down this much, that's how much it costs. Conversely, if I take that same money and spend it, if I'm way out here and I'm spending that much money, I get that much of a reduction. So the gist of this is the further one gets away from the reference point, the more expensive it is to get reductions in energy because of diminishing returns. And so this kind of a comparison, right, where you're basically scoring based on a reduction relative to a reference, encourages staying close to that reference. The further away you get, the more and more it costs to get improvements. And to get super geeky, and I know Ken will appreciate it, the way to fix this in theory would be to have a logarithmic versus a linear graph. And then that line would be a straight line. But that's not what we're talking about here. And I'm just trying to make the point that compliance measures in general don't encourage long stretch, improvements away from them. You really get the most bang for your buck in terms of the scoring close to that reference. Further you get, the less you get. And that's, what we see with the PHAUS. Another thing about these compliance things, they're really anecdotal. And this is a dated example, but I think it's illustrative. So let's look at a 2012 GMC Yukon Denali. It's 15 miles per gallon. We can call that 15 miles per gallon the performance rating of this vehicle. And here we've got a Honda Civic, and that gets a 33 miles per gallon. Again, it's performance rating. These we'll call the reference. These are the reference vehicles. So there also at that time was a Yukon Denali hybrid, which got 21 miles per gallon. Again, a performance rating. And there's a Honda Civic hybrid that got 44 miles per gallon. So one could ask rhetorically, which of these two, and we could sort of say these are being compared to the reference, but which of these two is more efficient? And I think most people are going to say, well, come on, Graham, the Honda Civic gets 44 miles per gallon. Denali gets 21 miles per gallon. This is clearly more efficient. And by a performance metric, that's true. However, if we look at the percentage of improvement, again, the whole thing with compliance, you're comparing, and as we talked about with HERS, and for that, and ASHRAE and Title 24, you're essentially comparing your building to itself with prescriptive measures applied. If we look at that, this hybrid got a reduction of 40% over the baseline. This one only got 33% improvement. So if this were HERS rated, this would get a HERS 60, this would get a HERS 67. So a worse score, not because it's overall performing worse, but because its improvement based on its own reference is less. And so that's important to keep in mind with any kind of performance measure that's based upon improvement over the same building with, you know, prescriptive measures applied. You cannot construe that to be the same as a mile per gallon measurement or a performance measurement, because this vehicle doesn't know about that one, right? It's not being compared to this, it's being compared to itself. So what are the conclusions here? Use the right tool for the job. Passive house for performance, HERS for incentives, which, you know, you may need to live with. Passive house, and this is in my opinion, does not get the credit it deserves, but it gets enough, right? Again, the passive house project I showed you, which should have cooling improved, nonetheless got a 34. And I'm not a HERS expert, but most of the incentive programs are not looking for anything below a 40. So yeah, it doesn't seem fair, but is it going to really affect your ability to get incentives if you're doing passive house anyway? Probably not. And there are a couple additional options. As I said in the beginning, on-site renewables also reduce your HERS score. So if you're doing a passive house with renewables on it, you're also going to improve your HERS score just like non-passive house with renewables. And there's also something called an innovative design request. And it's some sort of mechanism where you can appeal, I think, to ResNet and suggest that your building is not getting the credit it deserves. And I know there was a passive house that did that and got something in the 20s some point in the past. I don't know the ins and outs of that. I don't know if it's necessary, but if you wanted to avail yourself of that you could do. And that is really the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take time and answer questions. And
right.
I hope it's been useful and illustrative.
Absolutely. Thank you, Graham.
You're welcome.
It's a good initial dive into this for a lot of us, I think. As some of the comments and questions indicated, you know, there are definitely certain topics where we need to take a little bit more of a look. I want to first, so if you do have more questions, please put them into the chat. We do have limited time here, but we'll get to what we can. And again, we'll follow up and post them online. The video will be available online as well going forward. So if you missed some of the earlier part, there was a question just to get to briefly, Graham, on the sensitivity analysis, that software that you used. You developed that? Is that available? Is that something people can use?
I did develop it. It is it's in Excel, so it's a front end for PHPP. It is something I would like to share, but it is also more than, it is a piece of software, but it's also an approach. So I think it would need to be kind of a training, and I've been interested in sharing that for a while.
Oh.
I'd have to think about how that could happen, but it wouldn't be much good to anyone without some training and how to implement it. But I will, you know, obviously I'm biased because it's something I did, but I use it for every project. Like,
well, let's say we'll follow up on that.
Yeah, sure.
See what we can do, Graham.
Oh, sure.
That would be great. So, you know, a couple of big things that came out of it, just in terms of, I guess, technically, as we're optimizing and looking, one at the building and performance, is the solar gains, the overheating, and the need for shading and tackling that further, which you admittedly did not get to in this example. And the other part,
it was out of my purview. They didn't say, hey, redesign this house. They said, take this house and, you know, anyway.
Right. Well, and I think it's good. I mean, you kind of did it in a backwards way, if I could put it that way, really show how passive house is focused on overheating issues and trying to drive down the need for cooling. We're in a situation where pretty much everybody needs cooling at some point, active cooling, but we want to minimize it. And shading strategies are not to be taken for granted, that we need to do that. So, seeing those numbers bump up on that side of the cooling. On the other side of the ledger, though, I want you to speak to the solar, but also on the internal heat gains. So, the plug loads, the domestic hot water, and the lighting. There's always been this thing where the PHI default values do not necessarily match up to the typical American family and usage, and which we're well acquainted with. One thing I would point out, and I want to throw the ball to you, is it's really important when you're doing these energy models that you don't take any kind of compliance value at face value, and that you're running variance. So the PHPP in Passive House allows you to adjust all those values, and make sure that you are, to the extent that you can, are reflecting the intended use and the expected use.
Yes.
So in terms of like what you saw with the energy balance, I guess more to the solar shading side. I mean, I guess if you were starting with a blank slate and had the time to bring this forward, what would you be looking at doing, and
Yeah,
where do you see it?
I mean, one thing I think, and I'm an architect, but I also in the past did a lot of consulting with people who were unfamiliar with Passive House and like trying to bring their projects to meet Passive House. It's not, the key to it, I think, making it effective is you start in design, right? You have to design for efficiency. And so when you try to apply this, right? And it's, people think we're familiar with something like LEED or whatever, these green rating systems that are designed to be added on to an existing project, right? Passive House, as you know, it's a bothersome, it's a difficult or impossible thing to do depending on where you are. So you need to design, the performance of Passive House starts with the design. And if you take an existing design and try to make it Passive House, you're already kind of extremely handicapped. So
behind the eight ball.
Yeah, it would have been, what's the lesson? What do I take away from that? Just in the simplest way is seasonal shading is really important. And like, like a colleague of mine, Dave Brock, who, like I remember when I was going through this and he had done some projects in Utah and he had a house that had a front porch, but it was like a retractable shading thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, he's already, he got this, that they need that solar gain in winter, but in summer it needs to be blocked. And it's like my kids love baseball, but it's like a baseball stadium in Arizona or Florida, right? Like you got to be able to cover that in summertime.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, absolutely. So one thing strikes me, folks are trying to push down the HERS ratings, to improve them. And in terms of the code compliance and what we're seeing around the US, I know I poked around and I don't remember Massachusetts, and one of the commenters, one of the folks here mentioned this in Massachusetts, you have alternate compliance pathways. You have a HERS number. I think it's like a low 40s, 42, 45. It may be shifting 45 to 42. And then you have a Passive House compliance pathway. It seems like you should be able to hit the basic code requirements that are being driven by HERS by doing Passive House.
Yeah.
And then really the question is like, am I getting credit for what I'm doing? Well, I don't know at what point does that really matter. It's like you've got a better building and it's easier to get to zero. Like,
Right.
what's your thinking around that?
I totally agree. I mean, yeah, it doesn't seem fair, but it doesn't really matter. You know,
Right.
it depends what your goal is. If your goal is fairness, then yes, it's a real problem. If your goal is I have a project and I want to qualify, I'm going to do passive house and I want to qualify for these incentives, you're probably going to be okay, even without PV, right?
Right.
But if you're going to put PV on, it's gonna, yeah, you're gonna be fine. I mean, again, we got what, thinking back to that thing, I think it was a 41 versus a 36. Yeah,
Yeah.
not an earth-shaking amount of reward for passive house, but it's still a 36, right? I mean,
Right.
there's
Yeah,
no one
no,
no
it's
one's
good.
asking for hers below that.
And yeah. And I think it occurs to me, and maybe something to follow up on, or somebody in the audience might know that, I don't know how folks are using HERS ratings as a marketing tool. Um, where I could see that being a potential issue if you're doing a passive house without the PV to drop it. Um,
Yeah, you're
it's
gonna
not where
look
you're
worse
getting it.
than you would look worse than you could look worse than a code-built home with a lot of PV on it, in
Right.
theory. Yes.
Yeah, that's the whole getting to the whole net zero conversation.
Yeah, which I'm gonna resist dipping my foot in that because that will be here all night. And
Yeah,
I'll
fair
get
enough.
red in the face probably, but yeah.
Um,
Yes, it's not, I guess one thing I would say, and maybe people will take exception with this, I would not use hers as a design tool. Like, I think it's compliance, but don't think, hey, I want to build really efficient buildings. I'm going to use hers to guide that. I
right.
think it's like your tax return, honestly. Like, don't look at your tax return to determine what your profit of your business is, because it's related, but it's so adjusted by other things that it's not. I don't think it's, well, you saw it in there, right? You
Yeah,
see the
yeah.
difference between those two buildings and barely any difference in her score. So I would not use it as a design tool.
It's a good analogy. One last question. Someone in the audience asked about the relationship of, the uh, developer, um, uh, you know, mass-produced house, stock house, and the relationship of that to passive house. Like, do you see the possibility? It seems like there should be a way to make passive house viable, assuming the cost is bearable. But just in
Well,
terms of
yeah,
an optimization perspective,
yes.
what do you think?
Yeah, and again, I had high hopes for that back in 2012. It didn't happen. They built something close to the first 40 because that was their imperative, like their whole universe. I think the owner may have even expressed frustration with hers, like saying he sort of said it encourages people to build Energy Star. Basically, that's
Right.
because of that stickiness, right? Like you you don't get you don't get a reward. The further you go away, the harder it gets to improve. And it's a tight business. I think it will happen and it will have to happen. And the classic passive house economic argument is invest in the shell and save on the mechanicals. We all know that's a tougher prospect in a single family home, but maybe if you're building 100 or hundreds of them and you're shopping for hundreds of mechanical systems and you can find a more cost-effective one, then that could be an argument. I don't think the market hasn't quite gotten there yet in terms of low load mechanical systems, but when when a passive house mechanical system for a single family home is less expensive than a code, what's required in a
Right.
code, right? I mean, maybe that goes without saying.
We're getting closer with multifamily.
Right, and it should be because it's a lot smaller, but like when the market reflects that, someone's going to be like, yeah, heck yeah, I'm saving X number of dollars on every one of these houses times 100 or times 1,000. Sure, it's worth it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and then
I think
again, go ahead.
possible convergence, between the incentives, the market demand, and buildability, the components availability,
Yeah.
all of that.
And of course, also utility costs.
Right.
Right, and where that goes. And I'm a firm believer that we're headed to a place where storage, and I view passive houses as thermal batteries, right? They can store their own heating and cooling. Like, that's going to be very valuable. And when that becomes, passed on to the consumer, you're going to see a strong incentive there too. Again, another whole discussion, but
yeah, no, that's nice. That's a good note to end on, I think, as we move forward. So we're at time, a little bit over. And so I want to thank you very much, Graham, for presenting and joining. Great conversation. And thank everyone who joined us today in the audience, and your great comments and questions. Good discussion going on, I believe. And we'll be following up if there's anything that we need to. Please feel free to reach out. My email is ken@passivehousenetwork.org, and Graham is
you
there.
can there's a contact. The easiest, just go to essentialhabitat.com and there's there.
And we'll follow up on that sensitivity analysis, Graham.
All right. Happy to discuss that more. Thank you very much.
Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.